And welcome back to MTG-Eternities. I'm your host, Carl. Now, I'm going to take a small break to diverge away from what I normally talk about, of course, which is Magic. Probably about 10 days ago now was the last of Hurricane Harvey, and unfortunately, I was in the area that was affected. So here's ultimately what happened. The Thursday before the storm hit, I ended up boarding up my apartment as best I could. I sandbagged it as best I could. I got up all the electronics off the floor and everything like that, and I took what I could with me. And I was lucky enough that I was able to take my Magic collection. It's not as big a collection as most players that have been playing as long as I have probably have at this point, to be honest. It's a very large modern collection, it's a very large standard collection, and I do have a few legacy decks as well. All in all, that fits into sorted binders because I'm OCD like that. I think I have a total of 8, maybe 9 binders it's all sorted into. And initially that sounds like a lot, but I've condensed it down to quite a bit. So I ended up taking that and putting that into my car, got the clothes I needed, got the supplies I needed to outlast the hurricane. And then I helped my girlfriend with her stuff and put everything into my car as well. And then we ended up driving over to a friend's house a few hours away initially from where the storm was presumed to hit. And unfortunately, where it ended up going was that 2 hours down the road where we were. We got hit with a severe amount of rainfall to the point of which where water was flooding up to freeways, covering the overpasses. We're talking 15, 16 feet deep in some areas. Now, I was fortunate enough to avoid these areas, and the place that we were staying was in high enough ground that the water didn't get to the house that we were in, thankfully. And for a lot of people, this would have been a very stressful situation, and for me, it was rather stressful. I've never been in a hurricane before, as I'm sure a lot of people haven't been in a hurricane before. But thankfully, we made it out, and when I came back, everything, at least in my apartment, was fine. I'm going to not go into detail about what my girlfriend went through for her privacy's sake and all that stuff. But overall, it was a very stressful situation. Now, I was lucky enough in my situation that I didn't have any major losses. My apartment had a severe amount of mold in it, but because of my preparations, because I'm a little crazy like that, no water got inside my apartment, thankfully. Now, the apartments around me had water get into the base level. Water was seeping up through the concrete, stuff to that equivalence. But again, I was one of the lucky ones, and because I prepped the way I did, no water made it into my apartment, which again, I'm very thankful for. Now, with hurricane season, we're in the middle of it, and I don't believe it's over to November. I'm hoping no hurricane again comes up this way. We've had several hurricanes already starting to form in the Gulf. We had one hurricane already hit Florida. We got another one tailing behind that, and another one that looks like it's going to hit Mexico. After Mexico recently had a major earthquake, I believe it was an 8 on the Richter scale. And so Mexico's already devastated with another hurricane headed towards its way. Hurricanes are already scary enough, and I will say that they are rather scary enough in the whole. But to collectors, like a lot of Magic players, that the hoarders and collectors that we are, it's incredibly scary because you're worried about your possessions and stuff like that. Well, I'm going to kind of go over quickly a little tip-by-tip basis here, just on how I dealt with my hurricane experience, and maybe that might give you some idea on what to do should a hurricane come your way, or maybe another natural disaster of that kind. Now, granted, with hurricanes, we have the advantage in predicting a few days out where they're going to hit and what likely is going to happen. I'm not going to say it's going to cover everything, but it will work with hurricanes to my extent. With my size of collection, there are people who have collections far larger than I do who this will not work for at all. Of course, so I'm going to kind of start with the basics. As a basic, you should know that you should have your cards already sleeved. When you put them into the binder, that'll help keep water out. All my collections profits, and they're all sleeved and already in binders good to go. I leave them like that at all times in case I need to pick up and go at any given point. Plus, it makes carrying the collection a lot easier. Another thing that I ended up doing was for the hurricane, I put it in a double trash bag, so that's already 2 trash bags plus the binder plus the sleeves. So water would have to seep in and soak into the collection itself before it gets damaged. So as a third precaution, what I did was when we got to our location, of course, I put my collection up as high as I could, which was in the top shelf of a closet, and from there I kind of basically just prayed that no water's going to get into that high. If it gets up that high, we're all going to have a lot of problems. At that point, I'm not even worrying about my collection. I'm worried about my life. I'm worried about my girlfriend's life. I'm worried about the lives of people I'm staying with. So there's just like small little things you can do. There's not a lot, but if you're worried about your collection, obviously you want to have it sleeved, you want to have it in binders, you want to have it in trash bags. But the biggest thing I could say you need to do for your collection is have it insured. Always have your collection insured. If you can afford it. Magic, as we all know, is a rather expensive hobby. If something like flood damage happens to your collection, if you have the right insurance, you can replace your collection rather easily, or replace most of it and maybe have to pay for only a little bit out of pocket. But again, that's like for the most extreme collectors, that's for people who really want to make sure nothing happens to it. I'm sure it varies insurance company to insurance company how they would insure cards, but flood damage and fire damage and wind damage, all that stuff, those are kind of different damages. So I would suggest looking into insurance companies and see how they would cover something like cards. We all know cards fluctuate in value at any given time, so it's something that they would probably have to constantly keep track of, and you'd constantly have to let them know. So over time, it will become kind of a pain to keep them updated to the cost of your collection as a whole. But that's just something to overall keep in mind as something you can do. I'm not going to state how much value is in my collection. I'm not. That's just something I'm not going to put out there. But I will say that if your collection is highly valued, get it insured. If it's worth $1,000, $2,000 in total, that might be something worth insuring. $10,000, definitely worth insuring. For those insane enough to have $100,000 worth of value in Magic, those guys already have the insured. Those guys are doctors. Let's be real here. It's a requirement of Vintage that you have to be a doctor to play Vintage, or something to that equivalent. Just somebody that makes an insane amount of money. If you have any questions overall about hurricane stuff, again, this is my first hurricane. I can let you know a few extra steps you might be able to take in order to secure your collection. If you're not able to take it with you like I was, I can leave some suggestions overall, but my suggestions are just as that, suggestions. It does not guarantee that your collection will be safe. It does not guarantee that your collection won't be looted. And that is a real possibility. Where we were staying, there were looters in the area. There were trees that were fallen in the area. I'm grateful right now that I didn't go to Florida like a couple of my friends did, because now they're dealing with the other hurricanes that are going through there. And so it's not been a great year for the Gulf like I'm in, unfortunately. But hopefully hurricane season will just be over after these 4 hurricanes. Hopefully we won't get any more this year. We could all only hope. If you're interested in donating to relief funds, I suggest, again, if you want to donate to Hurricane Harvey victims or other hurricane victims, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Jose, anything like that, please do your research into what companies you are donating into. There are companies that are trying to scam people out of the money, and we receive no donations for help. I'm just putting that out there. So please be sure, if you're donating to hurricane relief funds or wildfire relief funds or whatever, you do your research. I'm going to go ahead and move on. I don't want to spend too much time on Hurricane Harvey or anything like that. I've put it past me at this point, and I hope I don't see another hurricane for a very long time. So I'm going to move to what you more than likely came here for, and that's Magic. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the Nationals that happened this past week. I wasn't able to keep up with them in my area, again, because of Hurricane Harvey, and so I'm going to go ahead and talk about that. The Nationals that happened this past week, if you hadn't been able to keep up with that, are the Nationals at France, Germany, and Japan. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the French Nationals first. The top 8, in order from 1st to 8th, are Boros Aggro, Red Deck wins, a Blue-Black Control List, Mardu Ballista, Red Deck wins, Red Deck wins, Red Deck. So France was a very red Nationals. It was a very aggressive Nationals, and as you can see, only one control deck made it to that top list. The only 3 decks that were different outside of Red Deck wins were the Boros Aggro, still kind of red deck, but at least you have the white in there. Blue-Black Control, the only true control deck, and then Mardu Ballista. The Mardu Ballista, we've reviewed that on the show before, so I'm going to kind of focus on the Boros Aggro and the Blue-Black Control list first. So for the Boros Aggro list, or as I'm calling it, Dwarves.deck, the lands it ran are 4 Aether Hubs, 4 Inspiring Vantage, 3 Mountain, 4 Needle Spires, 6 Plains, 2 Ramanop Runes. So what initially confused me at looking at this list was the Ramanop Runes. There wasn't any payoff for the Ramanop Runes. You're basically only using it once to sack to deal 2 damage, and that's if you're lucky enough to hit both. But we'll touch on why the Ramanop Runes are actually in the deck here in a minute. So moving on, the reason why I call this dwarf.deck is you have 3 Aether Geominers, 2 Depala making a comeback, 2 Pianilar, 4 Thraben Inspector, 4 Toolcraft Exemplar, again another dwarf, and 4 Veteran Motorist, again another dwarf. So Depala Pilot Exemplar is 1 red, 1 white, and 2 colorless for a 3/3 dwarf pilot. All other dwarves, while she's in play, get +1/+1, and all other vehicles in play get +1/+1. With as many dwarves as I mentioned earlier, you have Aether Geominer being a dwarf, you have Veteran Motorist being a dwarf, you have Toolcraft Exemplar being a dwarf. So she's giving all those guys who already have very high power another +1/+1 to their power and toughness, which is fantastic. The other part of her is going to come into play as well when we look at this list. All vehicles get an additional +1/+1. Her final ability, again with this dwarf and vehicle list for Boros aggro, is very important. Whenever she becomes tapped, you pay X, you reveal X cards off the top of your deck, and you put all dwarves and all vehicles from the top X cards into your hand and then put the rest to the bottom of the deck. So if you have a way to tap her at your opponent's end turn, like to say crew a vehicle end turn or something like that, you're able to pay X into it and just draw more cards, which it does give red a way to filter things they don't want away, refill their hand, which is something red doesn't see usually without a contingency on it, like discard a card at random, or discard a card, or if it's equipped with black, sack a creature, discard a card, lose life, something to that equivalence. And here the only contingency is you have to tap Depala, which I'm happy to do, to draw more cards or to filter out stuff I don't want. So I mentioned vehicles earlier, and this deck runs a 8 vehicle style Boros deck. It runs a 4 of Aether Sphere Harvester, and it runs a 4 of Heart of Khorne. Now, we all kind of expected Heart of Khorne to be in this deck. It's just in all vehicles decks. And the other one that kind of varies is Aether Sphere Harvester. Aether Sphere Harvester, flying, it gets lifelink every time you pay energy to it, and then it's a 3/5 vehicle. It's relatively easy to crew as well with a crew cost of 1. So you can effectively crew this at any time and block and gain life, or just swing overhead and gain 3 life. When it enters play, it also enters play with 2 energy, so you can do that a couple of times if need be. You could also use the energy from the Aether Hub to give this additional lifelink if you wanted to, which helps the Boros deck sustain itself. Now, the deck, of course, is running a couple of instants, not many. It's running 2 Abrade and 2 Lightning Harness. The Abrade, of course, is for the mirror match, if need be, against Mardu vehicles, or it's just a really great kill spell. There's a lot of artifacts and creatures that Abrade deals with. I think we can all agree that it's one of the best kill spells in Standard right now. The other kill spell, which is another great kill spell in Standard, is Harness Lightning. Now, you can harness something, not target it, gain the 3 energy for this particular deck, and use it to get more life with Aether Sphere Harvester, if you wanted to. Or you could use the energy from the Aether Sphere Harvester, the Harness Lightning, and the Aether Hub to kill something really big, again, if you wanted to. Harness Lightning has a multitude of uses, and because of that, that's another reason why Harness Lightning is arguably one of the best kill spells in Standard. Now, to finish off the Boros aggro, again, I'm just gonna refer to this as dwarves.deck. But to finish off the dwarves.deck package, you have 2 Chandra Torch of Defiance, 2 Gideon Ally of Zendikar, and 2 Stasis Snare. And these are all in the main deck. Again, Gideon allows you to crew the vehicles if you want to, or you can pump the team, or he can do Gideon things. I think we all effectively know what Gideon does at this point. And Chandra, again, is another way to deal damage to the face, draw you cards if you need to, and then if you alter, you pretty much got the game in hand. I don't see this deck alting Chandra that often. It seems like a quick beat face deck. I think this deck overall looks like it has the potential to win by turn 5 at latest, and because it can gain life, it'll out-sustain the red deck wins decks or the Ramanop Rune decks in the long run. Even though those decks do run Abrade, it's just something that, oh hey, Heart of Khorne or Aether Sphere Harvester, which one do I hate more? I think a lot of the decks made the mistake of going after Heart of Khorne instead of the Aether Sphere Harvester, and that's kind of where they messed up and allowed this deck to take first place. Now, when we look at the sideboard of this deck, you're seeing 2 more Braid, 3 Archangel Avacyn, 1 more Trondra Torch of Defiance, 2 more Gideon, 2 Magma Spray, 1 Nahiri, 1 more Scavenging Ground, 1 Sky Sovereign Flagship, and 2 more Stasis Snares. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was running 2 Ramanop Runes, and that only comes into play additionally more when you play Scavenger Ground. Scavenger Ground is the only other desert in this deck in that sideboard. So to me, the Ramanop Runes, although they are kind of like a panic button to get that additional 2 damage in there, I almost want to run Mountains over them or just something else because I'm not utilizing that card to the fullest of its potential. But that's just me. Obviously, it worked for the person who took first place with the Boros aggro deck, and it might be something to look into to give it a try. Now, again, before you buy all this deck or before you go gung-ho crazy with it, I just want to point out that a small portion of this is rotating. You have Needle Spires rotating, you have Gideon rotating, and you have Stasis Snare rotating. And that's just something to keep in mind. Of course, out of board, you have Archangel Avacyn rotating. So the deck as a whole still remains intact because a majority of it is from Kaladesh. So it might be something to look into investing into, but you aren't going to have as many bombs as you should. Now, that's not to say we're going to get red and white cards from Ixalan. We already have some cards previewed from Ixalan that look rather fantastic, and we'll go into those, I think, next episode. Overall, I do like the feel of this deck. It's highly aggressive. It's something a little bit different from the Ramanop Rune decks that we've seen and the Red Deck Wins decks that we've been seeing pop up in Standard lately. Overall, I like this deck, and I hope Boros is able to make the rotation. It seems like this deck will, and with the reintroduction of Lightning Strike back into Standard, I think this deck is just poised to get a little bit better. Lightning Strike to me is arguably better as a kill spell than a Braid. I think a Braid might take a backseat to Lightning Strike just for the sheer fact that it's kind of sideboardish. And hear me out on this. The difference between Lightning Strike and a Braid, I think, is quite substantial. Yes, a Braid for Standard is fantastic because it can destroy Torrential Gearhulks, but Lightning Strike can not only hit face where a Braid doesn't, but sometimes that 3 damage to the face will make all the difference before your opponents can even get to a Torrential Gearhulk. You can go 3 damage to face or 3 damage to a creature on the field. It doesn't specifically have to be an artifact, granted, but it allows you more mobility, I think. I think it's worth testing overall, and worst comes to worst, I think it might replace Magma Spray in Standard and make Magma Spray take a backseat into the side. But that's what testing's for. Moving on to the other Standard deck I want to focus on. In this particular event, it's the Blue-Black Control deck. Now, Blue-Black Control, I think, hasn't gotten as much press as, say, Grixis Control or Is It Control. I think Blue-Black's kind of taken a backseat. But where a lot of people are kind of missing is Blue-Black loses a lot less pieces, or at least a lot less vital pieces, than the Is It Control deck. And I think that's something a lot of people are missing. So this deck was running, I believe, 26 lands, 3 Choked Estuary, 4 Fetid Pool, 6 Island, 4 Sunken Hollow, 9 Swamp. So we're focusing a lot more on the black in this particular build. And this deck does lose Choked Estuary on rotation, but it gets something a little bit better in Drowned Catacomb upon going to Ixalan. So that spot's already completely replaced, so you don't even have to worry about that on rotation. In fact, Fetid Pool makes Drowned Catacomb come to play untapped. So that's already better than, say, Choked Estuary, where you have to reveal something out of hand. The deck itself is only running 6 creatures main. It's running 3 Scarab God, and it's running 3 Torrential Gearhulk. With Scarab God, in this meta right now, it seems a little slow to me, but overall it works. You're able to scry more cards away that you don't want. Opponent's going to take damage for every zombie that you have, so you're just eternalizing end of their turn effectively and returning stuff from their grave to your field, or you could eternalize a Gearhulk if you wanted to and make them lose life and scry more cards and stuff like that. The Gearhulks, again, are or Fat Caster, they've been called. We all know how good Torrential Gearhulk is at this point, so I don't think I'm going to go that deep into it. The rest of the deck is exclusively instants and sorcery. So you have a 4 of Censor, 2 of Disallow, 4 of Fatal Push, 1 Flaying Tendrils, 4 of Glimmer of Genius, 1 Hieroglyphic Illumination, 1 Negate, 2 Supreme Wills, and 2 Void Shatters. So this is basically a deck where we go, no, you aren't going to do that. And that's all this deck does. You go no, 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 no until you can either play Scarab God, or you go no until you can play Torrential Gearhulk. Now, the only problem I see with this deck is against a red deck, where there were a lot in this event. Now, I see how this deck was able to make it up through the ranks, but the biggest outlier to me with this deck is it seems to have an overall problem against the red deck. It's not running a lot of Wrath spells outside of the Flaying Tendrils main. And yes, that does deal with quite a bit of the Ramanop red decks, but you're relying strictly on getting that. Otherwise, you have to try to use a counter to get rid of their 1 and 2 drops, which I think that's where the Ramanop red deck has the advantage over this. It is running Fatal Push, but Fatal Push is a 4 of in the deck. Otherwise, you have Censor as an early counter, and that's roughly it. You're relying on Censor, Fatal Push, and Flaying Tendrils, because disallowing a 1-drop isn't terrible, but it's not the best use of your mana, in my opinion. There are better things you can do, I think, for 3, like a Supreme Will, Impulse for 4. Get something that you much would rather have. Glimmer, stuff like that once the next turn begins, of course. But then you look at the sideboard. The sideboard has 1 of Dispel, 2 of Doomfall, 2 Gifted Aetherborn, 3 Glint Sleeve Siphoners, one of Gonti, 1 of Kalidas, 1 of Liliana, Last Hope, 1 Negate, and 1 Summary Dismissal. So I think a majority of the time this deck had a very hard time against Ramanop Red or Red deck wins. So as you can see, the sideboard had quite an impressive creature package. So the red decks more than likely didn't know how to sideboard against this per se, because you don't come up against Dimir control that often, at least in our current standard meta. And so they probably had a hard time sideboarding against this, so they went and took out a little bit of their slower removal and adjusted a few things. Whereas this person probably took out their disallows and probably took out their slower cards to put in Gifted Aetherborn, Glint Sleeve Siphoner to draw more cards quickly, Gonti, Kalidas, that sort of whole package, even Liliana, to make their deck quicker, take out the Scarab Gods against the red deck. And it worked very well for this person. They made it all the way to top 8, beyond top 8, even going into the top 4. I would have liked to have seen this deck come up and play a little bit more often. I'm hoping this popularity becomes more. Upon rotation, you don't even lose much of this package. You just lose the Choked Estuary and the Flaying Tendrils, I think. That's probably it. And then out of side, of course, you lose Dispel, Kalidas, and Liliana Last Hope, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think you lose much else. And the look of Ixalan, it's going to replace those cards relatively easy. So this deck, if you're looking for something to stabilize upon rotation with, this deck might be, again, something you want to consider. And again, worst comes to worst, you already have half the stuff you need for a Grixis control list. You just need to look at what red cards you need to look at to be worth playing. Of course, you probably want to stock up on Nicol Bolas, or if you want to go Grixis Pirates, that's another option as well. Moving on, I want to go to the German Nationals. So in the German Nationals, again, same order, 1st to 8th. The top 8 are a Mardu Ballista, Ramanop Red, Timur Energy, a Blue-White Approach deck, Jeskai, Godpharaoh's Gift, Mono Black Zombies, Mono White Eldrazi, and Timur Energy. Now, a couple of those names probably stood out on that list as well, and to me the ones that stood out the most, of course, were the Blue-White Approach deck and the Mono White Eldrazi deck. Now, I didn't think I'd have to say Eldrazi at least in Standard. I was hoping I wouldn't have to say that in Standard, but Eldrazi's still strong enough to make one heck of an impact in Standard. And so I'm going to go ahead and put the Eldrazi on the backseat for a little bit. The other deck I want to focus on for right now, of course, is the Blue-White Approach deck. Now, we all know Approach the Second Sun exists, and it is a self-contained combo piece. I like the deck overall. I hope to see a little bit more of it. It's unfortunate, but I don't think this style deck would fly in my meta. There are an absurd amount of control decks in my meta, so I don't see something like this making it through the radar per se, but there's always hope. So the list overall, and forgive me, I'm probably going to butcher this name. I always have a hard time with it, but it's the Impnu Riverlet, 3 of. Then you have a Irrigated Farmland, 5 Island, 7 Plains, 4 of Prairie Stream, and 3 of Scavenger Grounds. Now, the Impnu Riverlet and the Scavenger Grounds main work off each other. They're going to mill stuff. And once they mill stuff, it gives you information about your opponent's deck, whether or not you're going up against Delirium, whether or not you're going to go up against a T-Hulk, or if you're going to go up against a red deck. Generally, against a red deck, I don't see it being too much of an issue unless you're like milling out a lot of their Eternalized cards. Other than that, you're just putting them on a worse clock, I think. And if you are playing against a Torrential Gearhulk deck or a Delirium deck or something to that equivalence, you do have the Scavenger Grounds to exile all graveyards and not care. So one thing interesting I want to make a note about of this deck, if you haven't got a chance to look over the list, it runs no creatures main, and it only runs 3 creatures side. So the main list is comprised of exclusively instants and sorceries, and then it has like 5 spells that aren't, like 5 enchantments. But the instants and sorceries, of course, the deck's namesake, a 4 of Approach of the Second Sun, then you have 4 of Blessed Alliance, 4 of Censor, 4 of Fumigate, 4 of Glimmer of Genius, 2 Hieroglyphic Illuminations, 2 Immolating Glares, and 4 of Supreme Wills. Now, right off the bat, stuff for rotation, Prairie Stream is getting rotated, but that's replaced by Glacial Fortress right out of the gate from Ixalan. So you got to look at the instant and sorcery list at this point. What do you lose? You lose Blessed Alliance, and you lose Immolating Glare upon rotation from the instant and sorcery list main. Now, Ixalan hasn't fully been previewed yet, but I don't think there's a 2-drop white instant kill spell to my recollection. But we still have a little ways to go. So those 2 cards can be replaced. Worst comes to worst, you could replace them with something with blue, and that might be able to take the place. Otherwise, the instant sorcery package remains intact. Now, from the other spells that we're looking at, you have a 4 of Cast Out, not gonna rotate, don't have to worry about that. A Quarantine Field as a 1-of, and a Stasis Snare as a 1-of. Now, there are cards in Ixalan that effectively replace those if you want O-Ring style enchantments, so if you're looking into investing in this deck, that's something you don't have to worry about. Also, I've never been a fan of Quarantine Field, just as a whole. I've never really liked the card, so I'm not sorry to see it go. Stasis Snare I am kind of a little sorry about. It is a rather good removal spell, but those cards I feel can easily be replaced. If you wanted to, you could even put Jace in the new deck. I'm thinking people are calling it Jace Sparrow because obviously we're going to a pirate-themed world. And Jace Sparrow might give you the sustain you need in the long run. So you want to look at the sideboard of this deck as well. You're running a 4 of Authority of the Consul. You're running 3 Negate, 4 Regal Caracal, 1 of Summary Dismissal, and 3 Torrential Gearhulk. So I'll go ahead and take a step back. I forgot that Regal Caracal is on the list. So Regal Caracal is there for sustaining reasons, and it can help in the long run against red deck wins or Ramunap Red or Boros, because it poops out little cats with lifelink, and it's going to make them 2/2s. And then Torrential Gearhulks, of course, we all again know what T-Hulk does. I am a little bit surprised to see Regal Caracal on this list, just for the sheer fact that it's a card you don't expect to see in Standard. I expect to almost see this exclusively in EDH at this point because of the cat deck. But it's good to know that people are willing to try it in Standard. And maybe Ixalan's going to just slowly put some really good cats in Ixalan for whatever reason. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think we're going to see cats for a little while, but it is a jungle theme played with dinosaurs. Maybe they're going to put another saber-toothed tiger in there of some sort. Even though we kind of had one of those from Dragons of Tarkir, maybe there's another saber-toothed tiger somewhere on the plane or something. I don't know. It's a possibility. But for the most part, this deck's sideboard is to go against the red decks. With Authority of the Consul, those creatures are going to come into play tapped, and you're going to gain life. So already out the bat, though they're not getting nearly as much value for their red hasters as they would like. The Regal Caracals just put down butts, and put out butts with blockers that gain life. So again, the red decks aren't nearly going to get as much value. Summary Dismissal does well against control decks. Negate does well against control decks. Torrential Gearhulk just does well in general against whatever you want it to. It could be a beater if you wanted it to, or it can be something else. Point of this deck, though, of course, is to Game 1, Approach of the Second Sun. And you have all these cards in here, by the way, to draw more cards. I am surprised that it doesn't run a little bit more draw. But the fact of the matter is, it is running Censors, so you could cycle those. It is running Glimmers, so you get to scry 2, draw 2 to that extent. A Hieroglyphic Illumination, again, draw 2. So overall, the deck is geared towards drawing and getting another Approach to the Second Sun. It seems rather consistent to me, and it's just something I like. It is a combo deck in Standard, so I can't complain. Somebody found a use for Approach to the Second Sun, and I'm really happy for him. I'd like to see this deck continue playing Standard, but I think once we get into Ixalan, I just don't want to say this deck's going to make it. I want to say something's going to replace it, and we're going to go more towards an aggressive blue-white build. But we'll see. Ixalan still, again, has yet to reveal itself entirely. The next deck I want to move to is the mono-white Eldrazi build. So, Again, as mentioned before, I was surprised to even mention Eldrazi in Standard because Eldrazi kind of effectively moved themselves towards Modern and Legacy. They haven't been as relevant as we would like them to, but to see them kind of make a last-minute resurgence before rotation does give me like a little chuckle, I'm not going to lie. So Eldrazi, again, are something to fear in all formats. So the land base of this deck, you have a 3 of Aether Hub, 11 Plains, 3 of Scavenger Grounds, 4 of Shefrit Dunes, and 4 of Spawning Bed. So you have quite a bit of stuff that's producing colorless. You have stuff that poops out Eldrazi already in the land base. But again, keep in mind, upon rotation, right out the bat, you will lose Spawning Bed with this deck. As will you lose all the Eldrazi with this deck. So this style of deck might be viable. Just don't count on Eldrazi or anything from Innistrad being in it. Mono white itself, in theory, is always a deck. But it's not always a tier 1 deck. Just keep that in mind. So the creatures from this list are a 4 of Archangel Avacyn. Right off the bat, you lose that from rotation. 3 of Eldrazi Displacer, that's gone on rotation. 2 of Glorybound Initiate, you still got that. A 4 of Matter Shaper, that's gone. 3 of Selfless Spirit, again, something that you're not going to see on rotation. 4 of Thought-Knot Seer, that's gone again from rotation. 3 of Inspector, 4 of Gone, and 2 of Walking Ballista. Now, with all those creatures that I mentioned leaving rotation as a whole, this deck will probably drop off the face of the earth come the end of September. You're not going to see mono white as a top build deck. You might see other things. You will probably see mono red. You might even see a green deck, a green stompy deck pop up with all the green dinos that we're getting. But I don't think we're going to see a mono white pop up. I think white's effectively gone to the support structure, and that's where it's going to stay for a little bit. Moving on to the instants and sorceries, you have 1 of Declaration in Stone, again leaving 2 of Spatial Contortion, 2 of Warping Wail. Again, all those instants and sorceries are leaving upon rotation. And then the other spells that this deck is using is a 1 of Cast Out and a 3 of Stasis Snare. Stasis Snare, again, as I mentioned before, is already leaving Standard. So as you can see, white is losing so much of its power, so much of the power that was developed from Zendikar, so much of the power that was developed from Innistrad block, and everything that I just previously mentioned out of that power is effectively just going. It's just going the way of the dinosaur, ironically enough. It's going extinct. We're not going to see that power return to what it once was from Innistrad and from Zendikar. We're not. For a little while, at least. I think, as I mentioned before, white has now moved to a supporting role upon the release of Ixalan. You'll still have white in Mardu vehicles. You'll still have white in, say, white vampires. But white vampires might not be the deck that you expect it will be. Again, we still have to see all the spoilers from Ixalan, but I think that white has moved towards, for the time being. Once we get both parts of Ixalan, white might make a resurgence again, especially with white vampires being a thing and white zombies being a thing. So the sideboard for this particular deck is 1 of Cast Out, 2 of Linvala the Preserver, 1 of Seagate Wreckage, 2 Sky Sovereign Console Flagship, 3 Solemnity, which I'm really happy to see Standard play, 1 of Spatial Contortion, 3 of Sun Scourge Champion, which I was surprised by. I guess this deck wanted more life gain, and 2 of Warping Wail side. Now, I do expect to see Solemnity see a little bit more play, and if I'm not mistaken, we have a creature upon the release of Ixalan that is effectively a Torpor Orb on a stick. So I do think that Hate Bears might be something to invest in modern-wise a little bit more if you're not already invested into it. And it might just be something to keep in mind. Solemnity does stop quite a few decks, and the Torpor Orb creature will stop energy decks almost in their tracks. You specifically have to have a removal or you won't get the energy per se unless those creatures get energy by dealing combat damage. Overall, I like this deck. I'm not sorry to see a lot of it rotating because rotation needs to happen for formats to be healthy. This September's rotation will be interesting. Just keep that in mind if you're trying to move product, that rotation is coming. The Reaper is coming for Standard and is coming in less than 3 weeks, folks. The final Nationals that took place was the Nationals in Japan. Again, from 1st to 8th, we have a 4-color energy, Temur energy. 4-color energy, Mardu vehicles. 4-color energy, Mardu vehicles, followed up by 2 mono white Eldrazi. Now, we've gone over all these decks before on this podcast, so I'm not going to really touch on these. I just want to make a mention and kind of congratulate those players who played those decks. So I think I'll leave Nationals Japan there. I'm happy that that I'm back in action again and able to do this podcast. So that's something that's kind of exciting for me, and that I have more material to go over than I've been able to go over these last few weeks because of Hurricane Harvey, because of internet issues and everything like that. So thanks again for listening, everyone out there. I do want to put out that I'm officially starting my contest today. I'm going to do a giveaway for everyone that is listening and would be interested. I'm going to put a picture out on Twitter, and I'm going to attach a picture down below in the podcast. I'm giving away a complete Dragon Fury kit from Khans of Tarkir block for those who kind of either didn't play at that time or don't exactly know what it is because your store didn't do it or something of that equivalence. It is a little board game that you play specifically with the Dragons of Tarkir dice. It comes with the little figurines that you're able to knock down. You roll down the dice on the board, and you try to knock down as many figurines as you can. It's usually in 2 rolls, and there are ways to track points and stuff like that. It's a fun little game. I think with my research, the estimated value of this prize is about $35. All you have to do to participate is follow me on Twitter or follow me on YouTube. Leave a comment down below on YouTube, and just let me know that you're listening to the videos. At the end of 2 weeks, I will put everyone in a random number generator or something like that, and whoever wins, I'll make the announcement via Twitter. I'll mail this out to you, no cost to you, complete Dragon Fury kit. So if you're interested, keep that in mind. For the next few weeks, I look forward to the incoming previews from Ixalan. I look forward to getting more guests on the show and talking more about Ixalan, talking more about Standard, more about Modern, more about Legacy as more stuff unfolds, especially with Iconic Masters. I look forward to talking about that to a great extent. Iconic Masters, if you've not seen the spoilers, looks fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and leave you guys this week. Make sure you tune in next week. And as always, all lines of thought are open for all Magic seekers. This is your host from MTG-Eternities. Happy to be back and signing out.